Pardon? Sorry, I now... Well, wait a second. Sorry, Jacob, you said you were going to come in, but you didn't indicate. But are you indicating now you wish to come in? All right, Jacob.
Yes. Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being enormously patient and Secretary of State for coming in so soon after appointment. Mr. Robbins, first of all, congratulations, because you must be very pleased with written ministerial statement number 20 today on changes in the mechanism of government, which move a lot of authority to your department. Where do you see your authority as deriving from?
It's straightforwardly, Mr. Rees Mogg, I report to the Prime Minister. I work very closely with the Secretary of State, but my authority, as both of ours does, comes from the collective agreement that ministers reach to our mandate in the negotiations, and that's what we are both working to.
And so the general principle that advisers advise and ministers decide is one that it's fair to assume applies, and that the criticisms of you as being the driving force behind policy are unfair because you're carrying out a role on behalf of the people from whom the power comes, and particularly the Prime Minister.
I think that's a very fair characterisation. Thank you.
Thank you. On the relationship between you and the two Secretaries of State, there were a couple of comments made during the evidence today that struck me as interesting in looking at that. One was when you said very early on that now with the Secretary of State close at hand in the negotiations, and the other was when the Secretary of State said that now all the advice will come to me, meaning him. The implication being that the previous Secretary of State had not been close at hand and had not received all the advice. Did David Davis receive all the advice?
So I think what we are both saying is that in the past, at the time for completely natural reasons, Mr. Rees Mogg, it's not, I don't think this was a bad decision at the time, but there were two teams of civil servants working very closely together, but one advising the Prime Minister, one advising the Secretary of State. Now, as I hope you'd expect, those two teams were the closest working teams you'll find in Whitehall, and they continue to be so. But I think what the Secretary of State was describing, and is certainly our preference for how I want to support him in the job he's got to do, is that it is more efficient and more effective if there is a stream of advice coming to the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State jointly that allows them to take a view on the key issues together.
So it will be a closer relationship than there was with the previous Secretary of State. That's fair from what you've been saying, that the separations will be removed.
I mean, for me personally, I enjoyed a very close relationship with the previous Secretary of State, and we worked together very closely over some very, very important times. And but I hope that the arrangement that has been agreed between the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for how they're supported over this phase of the negotiations will be, if anything, even more effective.
Okay, and in relation to the Chequers papers, Mr. Whittingdale asked you a question which you very silkily, in a very Sir Humphrey-like fashion, managed not to answer, which was, when did you start working on the evolution? When did you start working on the evolution?
We have all been concerned for some time, Mr. Rees Mogg, to deliver the policy that the Prime Minister set out in Mansion House, which was for as frictionless a trade as possible between the UK and the EU, and a series of other objectives for our relationship. Myself, a team from the Treasury, a team from the Business Department, the International Trade Department, we've all been involved in discussions with the Commission, with our other EU partners over the last few months. And so ministers, including ministers in departments, not just the Prime Minister, have been testing us and probing us and challenging us constantly over the last few months as to how are we going to achieve the government's objectives. So in that sense, from the day the Mansion House speech was delivered, we've been thinking very hard about how to make sure we deliver it and how to make sure that the negotiating position we advance with the EU is sufficiently precise to achieve our objectives.
And at what point was this more formalised? Because if we say the evolution began on around the 3rd of March, as I understand it, 120 pages were presented to Cabinet Ministers and those attending Cabinet shortly before the meeting of Chequers. When did those papers begin to be written?
So I hope you'll understand if I don't get too much into the weeds of how Cabinet papers are produced. I think there's a pretty long-standing convention about what it's right for me to say about that. It's up to the Prime Minister how she sets the agenda.
Details of what was in them.
Yeah.
I'm asking you for the timeline of when they were written, because this is very important in terms of seeing if Cabinet government is going ahead as one might expect. So the timeline for writing those papers.
So I think the Acting Cabinet Secretary addressed some of these questions with the Public Administration Select Committee a couple of days ago. And what he said then is that it's his role to give assurance on this, that in his view, well sufficient time was given to ministers to consider the analysis ahead of Chequers.
I'm not asking about how long they were given. I'm asking about when you started writing these papers.
So, I mean, these papers have their origins in other papers, and we've been producing papers about how to deliver our customs arrangements for quite some time. Sorry, maybe I'm misunderstanding your question.
You sit down with pen in hand at some point, or possibly with computer in front of you. I'm probably more pen in hand, or probably more computer in front of you. But if you'll forgive the assumption behind that, just accusing you of being modern, for which I apologise. When did you start preparing the papers for the Cabinet? An indication of the timeline.
So I think the Prime Minister asked for first drafts of the papers that she was considering at that point putting to the meeting about a fortnight before.
A fortnight before. Because the peculiar thing is that the draft white paper that was going on in Dexia seemed to be very different to what was being produced by the Cabinet Office prior to today's statement, written ministerial statement 20 of today's date, changing the mechanics of government. Doesn't that strike you as a little odd?
So, I mean, first of all, if I may, Secretary of State, as I tried to explain earlier in response to Mr Whittingdale, the white paper that DEXU were working on, and which was then largely published a few days after Chequers, is the product of a long evolution of government policy and development of policy in collective committees, in Cabinet and in speeches over many months. So there was not some sudden twist in the road where one white paper was done away with and a new white paper was written. The way in which the DEXU team had approached that white paper was they were conscious there were some open issues about the way in which we were going to try and get to the precise and ambitious prospectus for our future relationship that the Secretary of State was describing earlier. And what the Prime Minister decided, including in consultation with the then Secretary of State, was that that meeting at Chequers needed to zero in on those open issues.
But the authority to do that hadn't yet been given to the Cabinet Office by this written ministerial statement. This was a responsibility of DEXU. It's only today that that responsibility has been changed.
No, I think the Prime Minister, when she announced the creation of the Europe unit last autumn, she was clear then that we would be an integral part of the Cabinet Secretariat. An important role of the Secretariat is to properly inform Cabinet meetings and to put forward papers when the Prime Minister as Chairman directs us to.
And shouldn't the DEXU department or ex-U department have known that this was going on? And that these papers were about to be provided at the point at which it was writing something else?
I mean, as I tried to explain earlier, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, but the closest colleagues I've had in this job have been colleagues at the Department for Exiting the European Union, and they were throughout this process.
But they've said they didn't know. The former Secretary of State has said that he didn't know. So, are you saying that he is misinforming us?
No, I'm not saying that.
No.
I'm telling you what I can tell you about the process, which is that it was a close and collaborative one.
Thank you very much. I think that's extremely helpful. But it is worrying that the authority that changed today hadn't happened then, and that things were going on that the department meant to be in charge of it was unaware of. I attribute no blame to you at all, because you are answerable to the Prime Minister. Thank you.